Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, growth, and life-changing lessons. Today, we begin with a story that will inspire you to stand tall in the face of betrayal and reclaim your power. What happens when someone you trust the most steals your future out from under you? How do you rise above the pain and turn it into strength? Join us as we follow Jessica's journey, a story of heartbreak, determination, and triumph. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's powerful story and discover how she turned her greatest challenge into her ultimate victory. My name is Jessica, and this story begins in a small, modest apartment in Boston, where the weight of a single phone call shifted the course of my life. I was standing by the window, watching the winter light pour over the quiet street, when my father's voice came through the speaker. It was casual, almost light-hearted, as if he hadn't just admitted to stealing my entire college fund. "You didn't need it anyway," he said, as if that made it less devastating. "What's done is done. No point getting upset about it now." For a moment, I was stunned into silence. This was the account I'd spent years building. Every scholarship I'd won, every part-time job I'd juggled since high school, every carefully saved dollar, it had all gone into that fund. It was my safety net, my future. And he'd drained it without a second thought. "How much is left?" I finally managed to ask, though my voice wavered. "Left? None of it's left, honey," he replied, his tone still unbearably calm. "I had some debts to clear up. But don't worry. You're smart. You'll figure something out." The sheer audacity of his words sent a shiver through me. Figure something out. As if I had a choice. As if he hadn't just undone years of sacrifice while I was powerless to stop him. I had been studying abroad for a semester in Paris, and he had used my absence to quietly withdraw every last cent. The worst part? He was still a co-signer on the account I'd opened when I was 17. Legally, he had the right. But morally, it was a betrayal so deep I could barely breathe. "I see," I said quietly, my hands shaking. "Well, good luck with that. That's my girl," he said, mistaking my calm for acceptance. "Always practical. Just like your old dad. Listen, I've got to run, meeting some friends for drinks. We'll talk soon." I stood there long after the call ended, my phone slipping from my hand as his words echoed in my head. Drinks. He was off to meet friends for drinks, using the money I'd saved for my senior year. My chest felt tight, my head spinning with the enormity of it all. 3 months. That was all I had left in Paris before I was supposed to return home to Boston and finish my degree. Now, with no savings and no plan, I felt like the ground had been yanked from beneath me. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from him. "Don't mention this to your mom or grandma. No need to worry them." Of course. He didn't want them to know. Just like he hadn't wanted them to know about his gambling debts, his failed business ventures, or the countless times he'd borrowed money from friends and family and never paid it back. He'd always been able to hide behind charm and excuses. But this time, I wouldn't let him. I sat down at my tiny desk, the one overlooking a narrow Parisian street I'd come to love. I opened my laptop, my hands still trembling, and began making a list. First, documentation, bank statements, proof of deposits, records of the scholarships I'd earned, everything that would show how that money had been meant for me and my education. Next, research, legal resources, financial aid options, and potential part-time jobs. If my father had always underestimated me, it was time for him to learn just how wrong he'd been. I thought back to all the times he'd dismissed my achievements. "Good thing you're pretty," he'd say when I brought home straight A's. As if my academic success was just a footnote to my appearance. "You can always marry rich if college doesn't work out." But I hadn't worked this hard, come this far, to let him derail my future. Over the next week, I pieced together the full extent of his betrayal. The account had held just over $42,000, money I'd scrimped and saved for years. He had emptied it in a series of small transfers, each one just subtle enough to avoid raising red flags. My roommate, Emily, found me one evening surrounded by bank statements and legal articles. "Your father did what?" she exclaimed, reading over my shoulder. "Can't you report him for theft?" I shook my head, my throat tight. The account was joint. He was a cosigner. Legally, he had the right to access it. I just never thought he actually would. But I should have known. I should have remembered how he'd borrowed my birthday money as a child, always promising to pay it back but never doing so. How he'd tried to convince me to take out extra student loans in my name, assuring me he'd help repay them. Every red flag I'd ignored came rushing back, each one sharper than the last. And yet, his texts continued. "Don't stress about the money," one read. "Maybe this is a sign you should take a break from school. I know some guys who could get you a modeling job, better money than that degree." Each message revealed more about how little he valued my education, my independence, my dreams. To him, I was just another resource to exploit. But as I looked at the growing list of steps I needed to take, a new resolve began to form. He had stolen my money, but he wouldn't steal my future. That week, I made my first calls to my university's financial aid office, to legal aid services, and finally, to my grandmother, the one person in my family who had always believed in me. I didn't tell her everything yet. I just needed to hear her voice, to remember that there were people in my life who truly cared about my success. By the end of the week, I had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And as I looked out over the city I'd fallen in love with, I promised myself one thing: my father might have underestimated me, but I wouldn't make the same mistake. The first person I confided in fully was my grandmother. She had always been my biggest supporter, the one who celebrated every achievement as if it were her own. When I called her, my voice trembled with the weight of what I was about to share. "Grandma," I began, "I need to tell you something about Dad." Her voice was warm and steady, as if bracing herself. "Take your time, sweetheart." I explained everything: the bank statements, the drained account, the casual way he had dismissed my future as though it were a minor inconvenience. The words tumbled out of me, sharp and jagged, until I finally stopped to catch my breath. On the other end of the line, there was silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp with anger. "That man," she said, her words cutting through the stillness. "He's gone too far this time." Within hours, she had rallied my mother and Aunt Linda for a family video call. My grandmother's face appeared on the screen first, her expression both fierce and compassionate. My mother joined next, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone, while my aunt, a lawyer known for her sharp mind, listened quietly, her lips pressed into a thin line. I shared everything with them: the bank statements showing the withdrawals, the text messages where he dismissed my hard work, the history of smaller betrayals that now seemed like warning signs I should have heeded. My mother's face crumpled as she read one of his messages aloud. "He told me you decided to take a break from school," she said, her voice cracking. "That you wanted to move back home." "Of course he did," I replied bitterly. "He's always been good at rewriting the story to suit himself." My aunt leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the documents I had emailed her. "The account issue is tricky," she admitted. "Since he was a cosigner, legally he had access. But there might be other angles we can explore." "What kind of angles?" I asked, my hope flickering to life. "Has he ever made promises in writing about the money being for your education?" she asked. "Emails, texts, anything that could establish his intent." I pulled up my phone, scrolling through years of messages. "There are texts where he says he'll pay me back someday," I said, showing her the screen, "and emails where he acknowledges the account was for my college expenses." "Not legally binding," she said, a small smile forming, "but excellent leverage for what comes next." "What comes next?" my mother asked, her voice hesitant. "We hold him accountable," my grandmother declared firmly. He's spent years using this family as his personal piggy bank. It's time he realized there are consequences. The plan came together quickly. My grandmother would confront him first, letting him know the family was aware of his actions. My aunt would draft a formal demand letter outlining his options for restitution. And my mother, after years of hesitation, would finally file for divorce, a decision that had long been overdue. That evening, my father called me again. His voice was cautious, probing. "Your grandmother seemed upset today," he began. "You didn't tell her anything, did you?" I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you know you're standing on solid ground. "About what, Dad?" I asked lightly. "The college fund you drained? The future you tried to derail? Or just your general belief that my education doesn't matter?" The silence on his end was deafening. Then he cleared his throat, his tone shifting. "Now, Jessica, don't be dramatic. It was just money. Family is more important than money." "Exactly," I said, my voice cold. "And you betrayed your family." From that point on, every interaction went through my aunt. She drafted a demand letter that detailed every penny he had taken, along with options for repayment. When he received it, his reaction was predictable: first denial, then outrage, and finally desperate attempts to manipulate me. "You can't sue your own father," he said during one of his calls. "Watch me," I replied, hanging up without waiting for his response. What followed was a whirlwind of revelations. My mother discovered he had taken out loans in her name and attempted to remortgage their house without her knowledge. Relatives came forward with stories of borrowed money that had never been repaid. The facade he had carefully constructed over the years was crumbling, piece by piece. And with it, his ability to manipulate those around him. For the first time in my life, I felt something I hadn't expected: freedom. Freedom from his influence, from his constant undermining, from the weight of always wondering if I was enough. And as my grandmother had promised, this was only the beginning. The fallout from our confrontation with my father rippled through the family like a stone dropped into still water. Each revelation uncovered more about his years of deceit, loans he'd taken out in relatives' names, promises he'd broken, and funds he'd siphoned to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't afford. The family, once hesitant to challenge him, was finally united in holding him accountable. For me, though, the immediate challenge was survival. With my college fund gone and only a few months left in my semester abroad, I had to find a way to salvage my senior year. My grandmother, who had become my strongest ally, refused to let me face it alone. "I'll cover whatever you need," she told me during one of our late-night calls. "Unlike your father, I believe in keeping promises." At first, I hesitated. Taking her money felt like admitting defeat, like I was relying on someone else to fix my problems. But she cut me off before I could argue. "This isn't about bailing you out," she said firmly. "It's about making sure you get the future you've earned." Her support gave me the breathing room I needed to regroup. The university's financial aid office, understanding my situation, worked with me to secure emergency funding. I picked up a part-time job at a local cafe, balancing shifts with my classes and my growing determination to prove my father wrong. Every small victory, an approved loan, a passing exam, a paycheck, felt like a step further from the chaos he had caused. My father, of course, continued to send his infuriatingly casual messages. "Don't stress so much," one read. "Maybe this is a sign you should take a break from school. I know some guys who can get you into modeling, better money than that degree." Each word revealed just how little he understood me. To him, my education was a luxury, not a necessity. My ambitions were a hobby, not a calling. But with every dismissive text, my resolve only grew stronger. One evening, as I was reviewing bank statements with my roommate Emily, she paused and looked at me. "You know," she said, "I don't think he ever expected you to fight back." That thought stayed with me. My father had always underestimated me, treating me as a resource he could exploit, a backup plan for his own failures. But he had made one crucial mistake: he'd underestimated my resilience. Over the following weeks, I started to see the cracks in his carefully crafted persona. Relatives who had once defended him began sharing their own stories of betrayal. My Aunt Linda, ever the diligent lawyer, uncovered evidence of hidden assets, vacation photos, a new car purchase, and a country club membership that proved he wasn't as broke as he claimed. "He's not out of money," she told me. "He's just out of excuses." Her discovery added fuel to our demand for restitution. The repayment plan she drafted left no room for loopholes, monthly payments with interest, tracked and enforced by legal means. When my father tried to negotiate, claiming poverty, we presented the evidence of his hidden funds. He had no choice but to agree. Meanwhile, my mother, emboldened by the family's support, filed for divorce. Her decision was a long time coming, but it marked a turning point for both of us. She had spent years trapped in a cycle of excuses and justifications, always hoping he would change. Now, she was ready to rebuild her life, and so was I. My father's attempts to regain control grew increasingly desperate. He tried to turn my younger cousins against me, framing himself as the victim of my unreasonable demands. But instead of alienating me, his actions only strengthened my bond with the family. My cousins, inspired by my stand, began protecting their own finances, ensuring he couldn't take advantage of them the way he had with me. As the months passed, I began to see the depth of the damage he had caused, not just to me, but to everyone who had trusted him. Yet, amidst the pain and betrayal, there was a sense of clarity. His actions had forced me to confront truths I might have ignored otherwise: the strength I carried, the value of true support, and the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice. By the time I returned to the US to complete my senior year, I was no longer the same person. I was tougher, sharper, and more determined than ever. My father had stolen my savings, but he couldn't touch my resolve. And as I stepped onto campus that fall, ready to finish what I had started, I knew one thing for certain: he had underestimated the wrong person. In the end, my father's betrayal became the catalyst for my greatest triumph. What he intended to break me only made me stronger. I graduated with honors, secured a dream job, and built a life that was entirely my own. His attempts to manipulate and control me were no match for the resilience I discovered within myself and the unwavering support of my family. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't just about independence or perseverance, it was about the power of standing up for your worth, even when the person you're facing is someone you once trusted. Life is full of challenges, but every setback is an opportunity to rise. If my story resonates with you, remember, your strength is greater than any obstacle. Thank you for listening to my journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales of resilience and triumph.